It was the kind of late summer where the air still held warmth during the day but carried a sharp chill at night, the kind that could remind anyone how quickly the seasons shift in the mountains. For Daniel and Claire Foster, it was supposed to be the start of a new life together. Married just 2 weeks earlier, they chose to spend their honeymoon far from tropical beaches or crowded cities. They wanted the wilderness, the vast silence of the northern Rockies, a place where they believed they could celebrate love in its purest form, just the two of them against towering peaks and endless sky. Friends would later describe them as both adventurous and careful. Daniel had grown up hiking with his father, familiar with maps and terrain, while Claire was known for her meticulous planning. She had packed a new set of trekking poles, layered clothing for shifting weather, and a small first aid kit she always carried. Along with their gear, they brought something personal, a disposable camera, the kind you could pick up at any drugstore. They wanted to capture the trip on grainy physical photographs that they could place in an album years down the line. On the morning of their hike, they checked in at a local lodge, signing the guest book and letting staff know they planned to be out for no more than 3 days. They spoke excitedly of their chosen trail, a route popular with seasoned hikers but still demanding, winding through meadows, steep switchbacks, and eventually onto the shoulder of a glacier. Their excitement was obvious. Nothing suggested hesitation or fear. The first night, a park ranger remembered spotting them near the trailhead as the sun began to set. They were cheerful, Daniel with a hand on Claire's shoulder as they walked with ease, clearly in love and savoring every moment. But after that, no one saw them again. When they didn't return to the lodge on schedule, the staff first assumed they might have taken longer to complete the loop, or perhaps chosen to spend an extra night under the stars. It wasn't uncommon for hikers to adjust their plans, especially honeymooners who might lose track of time. But by the following evening, worry settled in. Calls to the lodge phone went unanswered, and their families, expecting a check-in, also received nothing. What began as concern quickly shifted to dread. The official search started within 24 hours. Helicopters swept over the jagged ridges and deep valleys, their blades echoing across stone and ice. Search teams worked in grids, calling out their names, probing the landscape for any sign of movement. Rescue dogs were brought in to track their scent, but the trail was faint, scattered, and quickly lost in the high winds and shifting snow. The terrain offered little mercy. The couple's chosen route climbed quickly into alpine territory where sudden storms could turn trails into treacherous paths of ice. Rescuers discovered partial footprints pressed into snowfields, but they led to nowhere, vanishing at the edge of a slope as if erased by the mountain itself. A single glove, red and damp, was recovered near a cluster of rocks, though no one could confirm it belonged to either Daniel or Claire. The more searchers combed the wilderness, the clearer it became how unforgiving the Rockies could be. Crevasses hid beneath thin layers of snow, waiting to swallow anything that stepped too close. Glacial streams carved through the ice, fast and icy enough to take a body downstream in seconds. Every possibility was grim. Some believed the pair had been caught in a sudden storm and lost their bearings. Others thought one might have fallen, and the other refused to leave them behind. As days stretched into weeks, the operation shifted from rescue to recovery. The search radius widened, yet every valley, every ridgeline told the same story. Nothing. No torn clothing, no scattered supplies, no signs of campfires. It was as though the couple had stepped off the face of the earth, their presence erased by the cold silence of the mountains. For their families back home, the waiting was unbearable. Parents spoke of waking in the night, convinced the phone would ring with good news. Siblings searched through old photographs, holding on to memories because they had no answers. In interviews, their voices cracked with the same haunting refrain. How could two careful, loving people vanish without leaving anything behind? Local newspapers covered the story extensively, framing it as both a tragedy and a mystery. Reporters pointed out that these mountains had taken lives before. They reminded readers of hikers who vanished in the past, their remains only found years later when the ice shifted or melted. It was a cruel truth of the region. Nature preserved what it claimed, and only time decided when, or if, it would give anything back. The official search lasted nearly 3 weeks before being scaled down. Resources were stretched thin, and with no new evidence, authorities had no choice but to call it. Volunteers lingered longer, unwilling to surrender hope, but eventually even they had to leave. The mountains closed in again, silent and unyielding, holding on to whatever had happened in their depths. By the end of that summer, the couple's disappearance was spoken of in hushed tones around town. For the newlyweds' families, grief mixed with denial. Without bodies, there could be no funerals, no graves to visit, no closure. Some clung to the thought that perhaps they had simply chosen to vanish, starting fresh somewhere else. But for most, the silence of the mountains suggested something darker, an accident, a misstep, a fatal encounter that had ended their story before it truly began. And yet, even in that silence, questions lingered. Why was so little found? Why no sign of shelter or struggle, no scattered evidence that the wilderness usually leaves behind? It was as if the mountain wasn't just indifferent, but deliberately concealing the truth. That unsettling thought would hang over the case for years, and for those closest to Daniel and Claire, it was only the beginning of a mystery that refused to fade. The search began before dawn, the first helicopters lifting off with their spotlights sweeping over the jagged terrain. From above, the mountains looked endless, sharp ridges of gray rock, rivers of ice frozen in motion, and valleys carved into shadow. Crews pressed their faces to the windows, searching for any break in the white and gray, any flash of color that might mean Daniel and Claire had survived the night. On the ground, teams moved methodically, combing the trails in coordinated lines. They carried radios, ice axes, and ropes, prepared for what they might find. Some probed crevasses with long poles, listening for hollow echoes below. Others followed the glacier's edge, their eyes scanning for scraps of clothing or disturbed snow. Every step carried weight, because everyone knew that in this terrain, survival could be measured in hours. The weather was both ally and enemy. On the first day, skies remained clear, giving rescuers wide visibility. But winds cut down the ridgelines with bitter force, erasing tracks within minutes. The thin air made exertion punishing, every breath burning in the lungs. By nightfall, as temperatures plunged well below freezing, crews huddled in makeshift camps, unwilling to abandon the search but forced to wait for daylight. On the second day, small signs began to emerge. Near a steep slope of hardened snow, searchers spotted footprints. At first glance, they appeared promising, 2 sets side by side pressed into the crust. But as the team followed them, the tracks grew shallow, blurred, and finally disappeared entirely at the edge of a wind-swept ridge. It was as if the mountain itself had swallowed them whole. Nearby, half buried in slush, a single glove was recovered. Red, waterlogged, the stitching frayed. It was photographed and bagged as evidence, though there was no certainty it belonged to either Daniel or Claire. For the families waiting below, these updates came in fragments. A ranger would call with clipped words, possible tracks, one personal item, no confirmed sightings. Each message felt like a cruel pendulum swing between hope and despair. Claire's mother clung to the idea that the footprints proved they had survived at least part of the route. Daniel's brother, more practical, feared that the prints ending abruptly suggested something worse, an avalanche, a fall, or disorientation in the storm. As more evidence was collected, theories began to take shape. The first and most likely was hypothermia. In the high alpine zone, a sudden drop in temperature could strip strength in minutes, disorienting even the most experienced hiker. Rescuers imagined the couple pressing forward as the storm closed in, only to become confused, perhaps splitting apart in the snow. The glove, they suggested, might have been dropped in the frantic effort to keep moving. Others believed they might have misjudged the glacier's edge. Beneath the snow lay hidden crevasses, cracks plunging hundreds of feet into darkness. A single misstep could mean an immediate fall, the body vanishing into ice where no searcher could reach. To test this theory, teams lowered cameras into fissures, their beams illuminating walls of blue ice. But nothing, no sign of fabric, no sign of life, stared back. Helicopter pilots reported seeing no bright flashes of gear or tents across the valleys, no broken tree lines to indicate a slide. Yet storms had rolled in shortly after the couple set out, strong enough to obscure even large objects. Meteorological reports confirmed wind gusts exceeding 60 miles an hour that week. To the rescuers, it meant one possibility was almost certain: the storm had caught them on exposed ground, where there was nowhere to hide. Days stretched on, each with the same routine: flights overhead, dogs led along ridges, volunteers moving in silent lines. Hope began to collapse under the weight of silence. No fresh tracks, no discarded packs, no fire pits, nothing that proved Daniel and Claire had survived past those first few hours. Even the glove began to feel like a cruel coincidence, a distraction rather than a clue. By the end of the first week, search leaders faced a grim decision. Resources were draining and crews were exhausted. The longer the search continued without results, the lower the chance of survival became. Families resisted, begging for more time, pleading that a cave or sheltered outcrop might still be protecting them. But the statistics were clear. In those temperatures, unprepared, survival beyond 72 hours was almost impossible. Reluctantly, the mission shifted in tone. What began as a rescue was reclassified as a recovery. Teams were no longer looking for people to save, but for bodies to bring home. It was a distinction that shattered the families. Without remains, they argued, how could anyone decide death? Yet for the rescuers, hardened by years of mountain recoveries, the reality was unavoidable. The mountain had won. Weeks later, the operation was formally scaled down. Volunteers lingered for a time, retracing the trails, calling their names into empty canyons, but eventually even they left. The helicopters stopped flying. The dogs were led away. Silence reclaimed the slopes. In the official report, the disappearance was recorded as likely storm exposure, possible fall. No bodies, no gear, no conclusive evidence, just fragments of possibility sealed within the glacier and snow. To the families, that phrase carried no comfort. It was an ending without closure, an explanation without proof. And as autumn closed in, the unanswered question settled like a shadow. If the mountain had taken them, why had it left nothing behind? That silence would haunt the families for years, until, nearly 2 decades later, the ice itself began to shift, and the mountain finally revealed what it had hidden all along. In the months that followed the failed search, the couple's disappearance transformed from an urgent crisis into something darker, an unsolved mystery that lingered in conversation long after the headlines faded. At first, people spoke about Daniel and Claire with sorrow, as victims of a cruel mountain that had claimed 2 more lives. But as time passed and no remains surfaced, sorrow gave way to speculation. Some whispered that the couple had staged the entire thing. Neighbors back in their hometown recalled how Daniel had once joked about moving somewhere remote, how Claire loved the idea of traveling without telling anyone. Those fragments, innocent at the time, were now twisted into theories that maybe they had used the honeymoon as a cover to disappear intentionally. Perhaps they had debts or secrets, or simply wanted to start fresh where no one would find them. To those clinging to that idea, the absence of bodies wasn't proof of death, but proof of planning. Others took a harsher view. They speculated about foul play, not from strangers, but from within the marriage itself. A young couple, still learning each other's rhythms, isolated in the wilderness. It was easy to imagine an argument escalating. A slip, a push, a decision made in anger that couldn't be undone. In this version of events, one of them had died in a struggle, and the other had vanished deliberately to cover it up. The lack of evidence only fueled these suspicions, leaving people to fill the silence with their own darkest assumptions. Another popular theory involved a predator. Bears roamed the Rockies, and mountain lions were known to stalk silently along ridges. Some believed the couple had crossed paths with something wild and powerful, caught off guard with no chance to defend themselves. But even that theory had flaws. Predatory attacks usually left signs, drag marks, blood trails, torn clothing, and in this case, nothing had been found. Still, the idea clung to conversations because it felt like a possible explanation in a story where little else made sense. Years passed and the case lingered without resolution. Occasionally, new stories surfaced, each one claiming to hold the missing piece. A trucker once swore he had picked up a woman along a highway in the Canadian Rockies who matched Claire's description. She had been disheveled, nervous, and carrying nothing but a small pack. By the time investigators tracked down the lead, the driver admitted it could have been anyone, his memory blurred by distance and time. Then, nearly 7 years after the disappearance, a hiker returned from the same range with something more tangible. He claimed to have found scraps of faded fabric wedged into the ice near the lip of a glacier. The material, pale blue and worn thin, looked like it had been frozen for years. He turned it over to local authorities, sparking a surge of hope and dread. Could this be the first physical evidence of Daniel or Claire's fate? Investigators cataloged the find, but tests proved inconclusive. The fabric was too degraded to determine ownership. No personal identifiers, no blood, no DNA remained. It might have been from a jacket or a backpack or any number of lost items left by countless hikers over decades. To the families, it felt like a cruel tease, proof that the mountains held answers but weren't willing to release them yet. Theories bloomed again, each one woven around that scrap of fabric. Some argued it proved at least one of them had fallen into the glacier, their body entombed in the ice. Others countered that it might belong to someone entirely unrelated, another ghost of the mountains. With nothing conclusive, the discovery became just another footnote in a story already overflowing with uncertainty. For investigators, the case file thickened but offered no clarity. Tips came in waves, often triggered by anniversaries of the disappearance or documentaries about unsolved cases. A blurry photograph from a trail in Montana, a rumor of a campsite found abandoned, even a claim from a man who insisted he had overheard a confession in a bar. All of it was recorded, but none of it substantiated. Every lead ended the same way: empty. Meanwhile, the families lived in limbo. For Claire's parents, hope never fully died. They spoke often of the possibility that their daughter might still be alive, that perhaps she had chosen to disappear or had been taken somewhere against her will. Daniel's family leaned toward acceptance, believing the mountain had claimed them both. These differences strained relationships, dividing people who once shared grief into separate camps of belief. As the years turned into a decade, the couple's disappearance became less a breaking news story and more of a cautionary tale. Guides warned new hikers about the dangers of storms, pointing to Daniel and Claire as examples of what could happen when nature turned. Campfire conversations passed down their story like folklore, each telling bending the details, each listener leaving with a different impression of what might have happened. But beneath the stories and speculation, one fact remained constant. There were no bodies, no belongings, nothing that brought the case to a close. The mountains had given up nothing more than a glove and a questionable scrap of fabric. Everything else remained locked away, hidden beneath layers of snow and ice that shifted with the years. For the families, time dulled nothing. Every anniversary was another reminder of the silence, every season another chance for the landscape to reveal a clue. They lived with the knowledge that closure might never come, that the truth might remain buried forever. Yet nature has its own timeline, and glaciers do not hold secrets indefinitely. While time and weather seemed to bury all hope, the truth was not gone. It was only waiting, preserved in the ice, until the day it was ready to be uncovered. In the years after the search ended, life for the families of Daniel and Claire became a ritual of waiting. Their photographs remained on mantels, smiling faces frozen in the joy of their wedding, reminders of a promise that had been cut short. Every anniversary of their disappearance passed quietly but heavily, marked by phone calls between relatives and small gatherings where stories of the couple were retold, as if speaking their names out loud could keep them from being erased. Birthdays came and went in silence. The candles on cakes never lit. The milestones they should have reached left to the imagination. Claire's parents lived in a house where her presence lingered in every corner. They never removed her belongings, never stopped setting aside space for her at holidays. Her mother described dreaming of her often, sometimes seeing her standing at the edge of a room, sometimes hearing her laughter down the hall. For Daniel's family, the reminders were just as raw. His father kept the last voicemail Daniel had left him saved on his phone, replaying it on difficult nights, listening to the familiar cadence of his son's voice before the mountain took it away. But grief has a way of dividing as much as uniting. As the years went on, the families found themselves fractured by the very silence they shared. Practical matters such as life insurance policies became points of contention. Without bodies, the process of declaring Daniel and Claire legally dead dragged on, with some members pushing for closure while others resisted. Lawyers became part of the story, drawing lines through what was once a shared circle of grief. The absence of proof created space for doubt, and that doubt poisoned relationships that had once been bound by love. Their siblings carried the weight in different ways. Daniel's brother recalled moments when the case nearly tore their family apart, the arguments so fierce that they left years of distance between them. Claire's younger sister admitted she resented the way people in their small town looked at her, as if she were defined only by the shadow of the sister who had vanished. In their private moments, both families struggled with the unanswerable question: was it better to assume the couple had died quickly, or to leave room for the impossible idea that they might still be alive somewhere, unrecognizable and unreachable? The community around them did not forget. Small-town newspapers ran anniversary pieces, each year revisiting the mystery. Journalists wrote about how the Rockies had swallowed lives before and would do so again. But this story had a particular hold. A young married couple, lost on their honeymoon, seemed to cut deeper into public imagination. It was not just a cautionary tale about the dangers of wilderness, but a haunting reminder of how thin the line is between celebration and tragedy. For the families, those articles were both a comfort and a wound. They kept the story alive, but they also forced the pain into the open. Neighbors would approach with sympathy, but also with curiosity, sometimes pressing for details the families had no answers to. Rumors, born from the vacuum of evidence, slipped into conversations. Some claimed the couple had staged their disappearance, others suggested foul play between them. Hearing these theories was like reopening a wound that had never healed, but there was no way to stop them. Despite the distance, the families developed quiet rituals of their own. Claire's mother wrote her letters on the anniversary of her disappearance, tucking them into a box that she kept locked away. Daniel's father drove into the mountains once each summer, sitting at the trailhead where his son and daughter-in-law were last seen, staring into the wilderness as though it might one day return them. None of these acts brought answers, but they were a way to survive the waiting. Through the years, the case continued to linger in police records, though no active investigation remained. Detectives admitted that without new evidence, there was nothing more they could do. The missing persons reports were updated occasionally, but the boxes labeled "last seen wearing" and "possible belongings" remained blank, filled only with speculation. It was an unsatisfying conclusion for those who had once held out hope that expertise and persistence could solve anything. The silence of the mountains became its own kind of torment. Without remains, the couple existed in a state of limbo, not alive, not dead, suspended between the two. Every spring thaw brought a moment of hope that perhaps something would surface, some trace carried downstream or revealed by shifting ice. Each year, when nothing appeared, that hope curdled into despair. For the parents, it was like reliving the first phone call of their disappearance again and again, the shock never fully dulling. 19 years is a long time to carry unanswered grief. By then, new generations had grown up, learning the story secondhand, while the families aged with the weight of what they did not know. The photos on the mantels grew yellowed at the edges, but they were never taken down. The vigil never ended. because without answers, there was no way to release it. And yet, while the families lived in silence, the mountains were changing. The same glaciers that had swallowed Daniel and Claire were shrinking inch by inch with every passing season. What had once seemed eternal was melting away. For years it went unnoticed, just another feature of a warming climate. But soon it would matter. Because the mountains, though slow and unyielding, have a way of keeping secrets only for as long as they choose. And in time, they were preparing to give this one back. 19 years passed, and the world had changed in ways no one could have predicted. Children had grown, parents had aged, and families had carried on with the silent burden of loss. But the mountains, too, had changed. The glaciers that once seemed eternal were retreating, shrinking back year by year as the climate warmed. What had once been an immovable wall of ice was now fractured, streams of meltwater cutting through its surface, exposing what had been hidden for decades. And in that retreat, the silence of the mountain began to shift. It started with hikers. Locals who had long walked the ridges began noticing strange things along the edges of the ice. A rusted fragment of metal, bent in a way that suggested it had once been part of a buckle. Fabric straps, stiffened and frayed, poking through melting slush. Even a cracked casing from what looked like an old disposable camera, its plastic warped but still recognizable. Each discovery was small, easily explained as remnants from the countless travelers who had crossed those trails over the years. But together, they began to weave a darker possibility. The reports filtered quietly back into town. People spoke about them in cafes and at gas stations, remembering the story of Daniel and Claire. For many, the objects were enough to reopen old wounds, stirring the thought that perhaps the mountain was preparing to return what it had taken. Stories spread quickly, carrying with them a chilling edge. The idea that the glacier was thawing, that it might finally give up its dead, set the community on edge. Some saw it as closure finally arriving. Others feared the truth it might reveal. Authorities, cautious not to ignite public frenzy, quietly reopened the file. The disappearance of Daniel and Claire had long since been marked inactive, the papers filed away with other unsolved cases. But now, with physical objects emerging from the ice, there was reason to look again. Detectives reviewed old maps, search records, and photographs from the original investigation, piecing together where the couple had last been seen and how the glacier had shifted since then. What was once speculation now carried weight. If belongings were surfacing, bodies might not be far behind. For the families, the news landed like a blow to the chest. After nearly 2 decades of silence, the sudden possibility of answers felt both unbearable and unavoidable. Daniel's father admitted he had given up hope years earlier, resigned to never knowing. Claire's mother, who had clung to the possibility of her daughter's survival, now faced the likelihood that her child had been entombed in ice all along. They spoke carefully, not ready to believe, but unable to ignore the mounting evidence. Meanwhile, the mountains became a place of eerie anticipation. Rangers documented each new find with photographs and reports, marking the coordinates and preserving the items for testing. They worked methodically, aware that even the smallest fragment could hold answers. But every discovery raised new questions. Whose belongings were these? How long had they been buried? And, most hauntingly, what else lay deeper in the ice? The local media picked up whispers of the story, though officials remained tight-lipped. Reporters framed it as part of a larger trend, pointing to other cases around the world where glaciers had retreated and revealed bodies of lost climbers, decades or even centuries old. The science was undeniable. Ice preserved what it captured, holding onto it until the day it thawed. Now, the northern Rockies seemed to be following that same pattern. The question was not whether something would emerge, but when. Hikers who stumbled across these fragments described an unsettling feeling. One man recalled seeing what looked like the corner of a backpack, stiffened with ice, protruding from a ridge. He said the air felt heavier in that moment, as though he were intruding on something sacred. Another woman admitted she turned back early from her hike after spotting what she thought was a torn strip of clothing, convinced she was staring at the edge of a story she did not want to finish. Word of mouth carried these accounts farther than any newspaper could. The mystery of Daniel and Claire was alive again. For investigators, the challenge was patience. They knew the glacier would reveal its secrets on its own timeline, dictated by weather and melt, not by human urgency. All they could do was wait, monitoring the site and preparing for what they might eventually be called to recover. Yet that waiting was fraught with tension because the prospect of discovery was not simple. It could mean answers, but it could also mean confirming suspicions that had haunted both families for years. The silence around the case grew heavier. Old rumors resurfaced. Had the couple fallen victim to the storm or to each other? Would the ice reveal a tragic accident or something darker? Each possibility carried consequences, not just for the memory of Daniel and Claire, but for the loved ones who had lived with their absence for nearly 2 decades. As summer pressed on and the ice continued to retreat, the sense of inevitability deepened. The mountain, once thought to hold its secrets forever, was changing. And with every shift, every drop of meltwater that carried fragments downstream, it became clearer that the mystery of Daniel and Claire Foster was not buried forever. The glacier was preparing to speak, and when it did, the truth would no longer remain hidden. It was a ranger survey that began like countless others, a routine patrol meant to document changes in the glacier's retreat. Rangers hiked the perimeter, noting fractures, meltwater channels, and exposed rock. But that morning, as the sun hit a particular ridge of ice, something unnatural caught their eyes. At first, it looked like an oddly shaped shadow in the thaw, a darkened form half buried in ice. But as they approached, the outline became unmistakable. A human figure was emerging, frozen, mid-motion, its contours preserved in the blue walls of ice. The rangers stopped. They knew immediately this wasn't just another lost climber or an unfortunate hiker from recent years. The gear was older, the clothing outdated by decades. The figure was strapped into a backpack, the strap still cutting across the chest, stiffened and hardened by nearly 2 decades of freezing. The position was eerily intact, as if time itself had halted the moment life ended. They radioed for assistance, their voices heavy with the realization that after all these years, the mountain was finally beginning to give someone back. Recovery was slow. Specialists were brought in, working carefully with heat and tools to free the body without damaging it. The glacier had preserved him with unnerving detail, skin pale but intact, clothing stiffened yet recognizable, even the laces of his boots still knotted in place. Inside the pack were familiar items, a water bottle, a weathered map sealed in plastic, and small personal belongings. It was as though the decades between then and now had been erased, the ice keeping every detail locked away. When news of the discovery reached the families, it was met with a silence that spoke louder than words. Daniel's parents were told first, the confirmation given only after DNA testing left no doubt. It was him. Their son had been preserved in the glacier for 19 years, waiting to be found. For some, it brought a measure of closure, an answer after so long in the dark. But for others, it was a shattering blow, proof that hope had been misplaced all those years. The town reacted with a mixture of shock and morbid fascination. For nearly 2 decades, the story of Daniel and Claire had been a local legend, an unsolved mystery that hovered in conversations and resurfaced with each passing anniversary. Now, half of that mystery had been pulled from the ice, visible and undeniable. Newspapers ran headlines about the discovery, television crews traveled to the small mountain town, and suddenly, the story was everywhere again. Yet even as cameras focused on the return of Daniel Foster, questions multiplied. Where was Claire? The couple had been inseparable, their last moments tied together in every retelling. If the glacier had held one, logic suggested it might still hold the other. But the absence of her body added a new layer of unease. The recovery didn't solve the mystery. It deepened it. Investigators combed over the remains for clues. Forensic specialists examined the condition of his body, noting how intact it was despite the passage of time. They found no immediate signs of violence, no gunshot wounds, no obvious trauma that pointed to foul play. Hypothermia or a fall into the ice remained the most likely explanations, but the preserved state left them cautious, unwilling to close the door on other possibilities. His position, with his pack still secured, suggested he hadn't been in the middle of a struggle to free himself. Instead, he appeared frozen in descent, caught in a moment that ended too abruptly. The backpack became its own puzzle. Inside were the kinds of things any hiker might carry: food wrappers, gloves, even a small first aid kit. But there were also items missing. The disposable camera they had packed was nowhere to be found. Claire's belongings, too, were absent. No sign of her jacket, no second set of supplies, no trace that she had been alongside him in those final moments. It was as if they had been separated at some critical point, their fates diverging in the vastness of the ice. For the families, grief mixed with unanswered questions. Daniel's father, in private, admitted he was relieved to finally have his son's body to bury, to no longer live with the torment of absence. But Claire's mother could not accept the half-answer. She spoke publicly about her daughter still being out there, insisting that if the mountain had given back one, it would eventually give back the other. Her words carried both faith and desperation, a refusal to let her child's story remain incomplete. The media amplified these emotions, framing the discovery as both a miracle of preservation and a reminder of how cruelly incomplete the truth still was. Articles detailed how other glaciers around the world had returned, climbers long thought lost, their bodies surfacing decades later as ice melted. Each case was unsettling, a collision of human tragedy and natural process. But Daniel and Claire's story struck deeper, because this was not an anonymous climber, but a young couple on their honeymoon, their love story ending in an unspeakable way. The official case file, long dormant, was reopened with urgency. Detectives reviewed old witness statements, retraced theories, and analyzed whether Daniel's discovery shed light on what might have happened to Claire. But for every question answered, another arose. Why were they separated? Had she fallen elsewhere? Was her body deeper in the glacier, or was there a possibility that something more sinister had unfolded between them? The discovery, meant to bring closure, instead reopened the wound entirely. It gave the families something tangible to hold, but it also pulled them back into the vortex of speculation, theories, and half-truths. For the town, it turned an old story into a living one again, forcing everyone to ask the same haunting question. If the mountain had returned Daniel, how long before it revealed the fate of Claire? Weeks after Daniel's body was recovered, the glacier gave up something else. Rangers on a follow-up survey spotted a glint of plastic protruding from the ice, half buried in meltwater. At first glance, it looked like trash, an artifact from long-forgotten travelers. But as they pulled it free, they realized it was more than debris. It was a disposable camera, the kind Daniel and Claire had been known to carry, its casing cracked but intact, the film roll. Still sealed inside, frozen solid from nearly 2 decades in the glacier. The discovery electrified investigators. Photographs had the potential to tell a story in ways that testimony and speculation never could. The camera was rushed to a forensic lab specializing in film preservation, where technicians worked carefully, drying and cleaning each frame, coaxing out images frame by frame. The process was delicate. Much of the roll had been ruined by time and ice, the chemicals too degraded to recover. But against the odds, several photographs emerged, ghost-like, yet clear enough to piece together. The first few images were almost mundane, snapshots of a honeymoon hike. Daniel and Claire stood smiling, arms around each other, the peaks of the Rockies towering behind them. Their expressions were joyful, unguarded, the kind of photographs couples take when imagining they'll one day flip through them in an album. Each frame carried the innocence of a trip that had begun as a celebration, untouched by the tragedy that would follow. The recovered sequence continued with scenic shots, snow-covered ridges, sharp cliffs, wildflower meadows perched against a backdrop of glaciers. It was the same landscape rescuers had searched years earlier, now captured in frozen detail on cheap film. But gradually, the photographs shifted. The skies in the images grew darker, the light dimmer. A few frames showed clouds rolling in, heavy and unsettled. In one, Claire appeared with her jacket pulled tight, strands of hair whipped sideways by wind. The casual ease of the earlier shots had vanished. Then came the most haunting sequence. Several photos, blurry and underexposed, showed the signs of worsening weather, white streaks of snow or sleet against the lens, angles tilted as though taken in haste. In one, Daniel's expression was tense, his jaw set, his eyes narrowed against the storm. Another frame showed Claire standing near a jagged crevasse, her form slightly blurred, as though she had moved at the instant the shutter clicked. Her face, though indistinct, carried something unsettling, an expression that seemed less posed, more startled, as if something had drawn her attention off camera. The final frame was the most disturbing. The photograph was partially damaged, but still legible. Claire appeared again, her figure caught at the edge of the shot, her body angled backward as if stepping away from something. The background showed the fractured mouth of the glacier, a void of ice and shadow. Her expression was blurred by motion, but even in that distortion, viewers felt a jolt of unease. It didn't look like a posed photo. It looked like the accidental capture of a moment when something had gone terribly wrong. When the photographs were shown to the families, reactions were visceral. Claire's mother wept at the sight of her daughter's smile in the early shots, as though seeing her alive again after 19 years. Daniel's brother studied the later. Frames in silence, fixating on the storm clouds and the strain in his brother's face. For them, the images offered both comfort and torment. They gave back moments long thought lost, but they also froze forever the lead-up to tragedy without offering a clear explanation of what had truly happened. Investigators pored over the photographs, dissecting every angle. The sequence confirmed at least part of the timeline. The couple had been alive and together as the storm closed in, moving toward the glacial ridge where Daniel's body had eventually been found. But the photographs also deepened the mystery. The crevasse in the final frames became a point of focus. Has Claire fallen there? Was that why her body had not been found alongside her husband's? Or did the startled expression in her final image suggest something else? An external force, an accident, or even conflict between the two? The missing frames, too, carried weight. Technicians explained that several exposures had been irreparably damaged, blackened beyond recovery. No one could say what those lost images might have shown. For the families, that absence became almost unbearable. Had those frames captured the crucial moments, would they have revealed whether the tragedy was a simple accident or something darker? Media coverage of the photographs reignited public fascination. Newspapers printed blurred reproductions, highlighting the unsettling final image of Claire near the crevasse. Commentators speculated openly. Some insisted she had been startled by the storm, others suggested she had slipped, while more sensational voices whispered about arguments or foul play. The photographs, intended to preserve memories of joy, instead became evidence debated by strangers who had never known them. For authorities, the photographs were both a breakthrough and a dead end. They proved the couple had been alive and together as conditions worsened. They provided a potential location for Claire's last known presence. But they also raised questions that could not yet be answered. With Daniel's body recovered and Claire still missing, the case was no closer to resolution. The photographs only made clear that something had happened on the edge of that glacier, something violent enough to separate the couple forever. And so, the discovery of the camera, instead of closing the mystery, pushed it further into shadow. The images gave glimpses but no resolution, proof without context, faces frozen in time without explanation. Families and investigators alike were left staring at the same haunting conclusion. If this was the story of their final hours, it was only half written. Claire was still missing, and until the mountain returned her too, the photographs would remain a cruel tease of the truth. The glacier kept shifting, shedding ice with each passing week. Rangers and forensic teams had grown accustomed to revisiting the site, documenting what the thaw exposed. And then, one morning, a ranger spotted what he first mistook for a twisted branch protruding from the ice. On closer inspection, it wasn't wood at all. It was bone. Humans. Further excavation revealed the outline of another body, wedged deeper within the glacier, partially contorted as if trapped mid-motion during her final moments. The remains were carefully extracted, the process painstaking. Ice was melted in controlled increments, revealing fragments of fabric, strands of hair still preserved, and finally, the body itself. It was Claire. After nearly 2 decades missing, she too had been returned by the mountain. Yet the discovery brought no peace. Her position was unnatural, her arm bent sharply across her body, not in a relaxed fall, but in a defensive posture, as though she had been shielding herself from something. Forensic examiners studied her closely. While Daniel's body had been unnervingly intact, Claire's showed signs that unsettled investigators. Several ribs were fractured, though not in the pattern usually seen from a fall. Her wrist bore damage consistent with blunt force, rather than an impact from striking ice at speed. Most chillingly, bruising patterns remained faintly visible on her upper arms, marks that suggested she had been gripped with force before death. The glacier had preserved more than just her body. It had preserved signs of violence. Theories that had circulated in whispers for years resurfaced instantly. For so long, people had speculated about whether the couple had turned on each other in those final hours, isolated in the storm. Now, with Claire's remains telling a story of struggle, those theories gained momentum. Rumors spread that Daniel, long thought to be a victim of the mountain, may have been something else entirely, the aggressor. Investigators debated carefully. Some argued the injuries could still be explained by accident. In a storm, battered by wind and ice, falls could be chaotic, bodies twisted unnaturally against the glacier's jagged surface. The defensive posture could have been the result of how her body froze mid-motion, not proof of intent. But others weren't convinced. The bruising patterns, the fractures, the strange positioning, it all pointed to something more deliberate. For the families, the discovery fractured them further. Daniel's relatives recoiled at the implication, unwilling to believe their son or brother had harmed his wife. To them, the evidence was circumstantial, the interpretation cruel. They clung to the idea that both had been victims of the storm, preserved in ice by chance, nothing more. Claire's family, however, could not ignore the findings. To them, the bruises on her arms and the unnatural bend of her posture looked like the silent testimony of a woman fighting back. The town, too, became divided. Headlines screamed of foul play, framing the tragedy as a possible crime scene rather than a natural accident. Locals who had once spoken sympathetically about Daniel now whispered suspicions, wondering aloud if the honeymoon story had masked something far darker. Conversations at gas stations and diners carried the weight of accusation, and strangers began to speak of Daniel not as a victim, but as the man who may have pushed his wife into death. Forensic specialists treaded carefully, refusing to make definitive statements. They explained the limits of preservation, how ice distorted and compressed remains over time. Injuries could be misinterpreted. Yet even with their caution, the idea had taken hold. Once a rumor became a possibility, it was nearly impossible to put it back to rest. The photographs from the camera only added fuel. Investigators revisited the final images of Claire near the crevasse, her blurred face turned in what looked like alarm. Combined with her injuries, the sequence painted a narrative that was difficult to dismiss. Had there been an argument in those last hours? Had the storm, isolation, and exhaustion brought tensions boiling to the surface? If so, had Daniel lashed out? And if he had his own death been the result of guilt or simply the same unforgiving landscape? The families were left to wrestle with these questions, each side defending the memory of the person they loved. Daniel's parents issued statements emphasizing his character, reminding the public that he had been raised to be gentle, dependable, incapable of violence. Claire's mother, in contrast, spoke bitterly of her daughter's final moments, insisting the signs on her body spoke louder than any speculation. The tension between them mirrored the fractures in the investigation itself. Two families bound by tragedy, now separated by suspicion. The official reports remained careful, never labeling the case as homicide, never closing the possibility of accident. But in the court of public opinion, the verdict was already being debated. And for those who had followed the story since the very beginning, the return of Claire's body was not the closure they had hoped for. It was the beginning of a new, darker chapter, one where the mystery was not just about how they died, but about whether love had turned to violence on the edge of a glacier. And as the ice continued to retreat, investigators braced for more. If the mountain had preserved signs of a struggle, what else might it still be holding? What final truth remained locked away in the glacier, waiting to be revealed? The return of Claire's body forced investigators to revisit every detail, every piece of evidence that had surfaced since the glacier began to thaw. For nearly 2 decades, the case had been suspended in speculation, trapped in silence as solid as the ice itself. Now, with both bodies recovered and the camera photographs in hand, a clearer, though more unsettling, narrative began to emerge. Forensic specialists started with the injuries. Daniel's body had shown no obvious trauma beyond the signs consistent with hypothermia and eventual freezing. Claire's, however, told a different story. Her rib fractures were jagged, aligned with impact against sharp glacial edges. The position of her wrist, the faint bruises on her arms, suggested something more than an accident. When mapped against the landscape, investigators realized her injuries were not consistent with a simple fall taken together with her husband. Instead, they pointed toward her being pushed, whether intentional or in the heat of an argument. The photographs became crucial in building this picture. Analysts studied the sequence carefully, comparing the backgrounds of the final images to the locations where the bodies were found. The shots of worsening weather confirmed the couple had pressed into the storm despite the risks. Then came the final frames: Daniel's tense jawline, Claire's blurred figure near the crevasse, her body angled as though reacting to something unseen. What struck investigators was the subtle shift in their demeanor. Early photos radiated joy, but in the last few, their smiles were gone, replaced with expressions of strain and unease. The tension was subtle, almost invisible to outsiders at first glance, but unmistakable when placed against the physical evidence. Experts pieced together what may have happened. In the storm, exhausted and disoriented, the couple may have argued about whether to press on or turn back. Stress, isolation, and the sheer brutality of the environment could have inflamed even the smallest disagreement. At some point near the crevasse, that argument escalated. The bruises on Claire's arms suggested force, hands gripping tightly. The fractures in her ribs aligned with her falling hard against jagged ice after being shoved or pushed back. Once she fell, investigators believed Daniel may have tried to reach her. His position, preserved upright with his pack still strapped, suggested he descended toward the crevasse, perhaps in panic or regret. But in the attempt, he too lost footing, slipping into the glacier's depths. Unlike Claire, his body showed no defensive posture, no signs of active struggle. It seemed likely that his end had come in the chaotic aftermath of hers. The scenario was grim but plausible. The glacier had preserved not just their bodies, but the violent moment that ended their story. To the families, hearing this interpretation was devastating. For Daniel's relatives, the idea that he had pushed his wife, even in anger or desperation, was almost impossible to accept. They clung to alternate explanations, suggesting her injuries might still have been caused by the environment, not by his hand. But forensic examiners, after months of study, leaned heavily toward the conclusion that her wounds were inflicted in the seconds before her fall. Claire's family, though heartbroken, found in the findings a bitter clarity. To them, it explained the subtle unease they had long felt when reviewing the details of the disappearance. Her mother pointed to the final photograph, her daughter's blurred face near the crevasse, as evidence that she had been frightened in those last moments. For her, the glacier's release had not only given back her daughter's body, but also the truth of what she endured. The investigators, careful with their language, stopped short of labeling the case a homicide. Without witnesses, without full certainty, they classified it as a likely fatal argument turned accidental death for both. But the implication was unavoidable. What began as a honeymoon in celebration had ended as a moment of violence sealed in ice for 19 years. The findings reignited debate in the community and the media. Some argued the interpretation was too speculative, that science could not truly capture intent from fractured bones and blurred photographs. Others believed the evidence was undeniable, that the glacier had entombed a crime of passion and preserved it until time itself revealed it. The story drew national attention once again, not just as a mystery of the wilderness, but as a chilling reminder of how quickly love could turn lethal under pressure. For the families, closure came in fragments. Daniel was buried near his childhood home, Claire near hers, their graves separated in both geography and memory. The funerals, though solemn, carried different tones, one marked by defiance against the narrative of guilt, the other by acceptance of what the evidence seemed to show. Neither family emerged whole, each fractured by the truth preserved in ice. And yet, even as they buried their dead, the unanswered weight lingered. Could investigators ever truly know what words were spoken in those last moments? Could anyone say with certainty whether Daniel's actions were deliberate or the tragic mistake of a man blinded by storm and fear? The glacier had returned their bodies, but it had left just enough ambiguity to ensure that the violent moment would haunt everyone who studied it. The truth, as much as it could be known, was now in the open. But it was not the kind of truth that soothed. It was a truth that revealed the darkness of human frailty, preserved as starkly as the bodies themselves. And as investigators filed their final reports, one line echoed above all else. The glacier had not merely hidden a mystery. It had entombed the story of a marriage that ended in violence, releasing it only when time demanded it. 19 years after Daniel and Claire set out on their honeymoon hike, the mountain finally surrendered both of them. What began as silence and absence ended with funerals that, for the first time, offered something tangible to bury. The families gathered, standing in the shadow of graves that should never have existed, their loved ones laid to rest side by side. Yet, even in the solemn quiet of those services, the truth weighed heavily. What had been uncovered in the glacier was not simply a survival tragedy, but something darker. For nearly 2 decades, they had been remembered as victims of the wilderness, a couple swallowed by storm and ice, but the evidence preserved with their bodies told a harsher story. The fractures in Claire's ribs, the bruises on her arms, the final blurred photograph near the crevasse, each detail built a picture that could no longer be ignored. Investigators had concluded that the couple's final moments were not shaped solely by the elements, but by violence. An argument on the glacier had spiraled into something irreversible, ending with Claire's fall and Daniel's fatal attempt to follow. It was the kind of truth that left no one at peace. Daniel's family refused to accept the suggestion of guilt, defending him as a man incapable of harming his wife. They spoke at his funeral of his humor, his loyalty, and his kindness. They insisted that the signs on Claire's body could be explained by the chaos of the storm, not by his hands. For them, the glacier had preserved a son and brother, not a villain. Claire's family, however, left her service with a different understanding. For years they had imagined her final hours, the fear she must have felt in the storm, the pain of being lost to silence. Now, the evidence gave that fear a shape. Her mother told those gathered that the bruises were not just marks on skin, but testimony, a record of what her daughter had endured. She buried her child with the belief that Claire had died not just because of the mountain, but because of a moment of human violence in the place she should have been safest. The decision to bury them side by side was not simple. It was made as a gesture toward the life they had shared before those final hours, but it unsettled both families. At the graveside, relatives stood apart, each grieving in their own truth, unable to reconcile what had happened. The headstones carried the same dates, but the stories spoken about them could not have been more different. In the community, The case became a subject of endless debate. Some believed the forensic evidence left little doubt, pointing to it as a reminder of how quickly domestic disputes can escalate, even in marriages that seem happy. Others rejected the idea, holding on to the narrative of a storm claiming 2 innocent lives. What united them all, however, was unease. The story no longer fits the simple frame of nature's cruelty. It had become something more personal, more human, and therefore more haunting. The media framed the case as both a mystery solved and a tragedy redefined. Headlines spoke of violence preserved in ice, of a honeymoon gone fatally wrong. Documentaries revisited the photographs, showing the smiling faces of Daniel and Claire in their first frames and the ominous tension of their last. For audiences who had followed the disappearance for years, the revelation was both shocking and inevitable. The Glacier had not only preserved their bodies, it had preserved the darkest truth about how they died. For investigators, closing the case brought no satisfaction. They had pieced together the evidence, weighed the injuries against the photographs, and produced a conclusion that fit the facts. Yet they knew it could never capture the full truth. No one would ever know the exact words spoken in that final argument, or the precise moment when love turned to anger. What they had was the outline of an ending, not the complete story. Still, it was more than anyone had expected when the search first failed all those years ago. The families left with scars that time could not erase. Claire's mother spoke of forgiveness, but it was laced with bitterness, a forgiveness born not from peace, but from exhaustion. Daniel's father spoke of legacy, determined to defend his son's memory even against the evidence. Between them, the silence stretched, 2 families bound forever by the same loss, yet divided by the meaning of it. And for the community, the case settled into history as a reminder of how the mountains keep their secrets. For 19 years, ice had hidden not just 2 bodies, but the truth of what happened between them. Only when the glacier retreated, when the earth itself shifted, did that truth rise to the surface. The discovery was not the closure anyone wanted, but it was the closure they received. In the end, the story of Daniel and Claire Foster was not about being swallowed by the wilderness, nor simply about the cruelty of storms and glaciers. It was about a dark secret preserved in ice, a fatal argument on a honeymoon that ended with both of them lost forever. The glacier had entombed their final moments, holding on to them for nearly 2 decades, and then, with time, forced the truth to the surface. It was a truth that could not be undone, a truth that left scars long after the ice was gone.